In the summer of 1914, London was the center of the financial world. The pound sterling was the currency in which international trade was settled, in which debts were denominated, in which the value of things was ultimately measured. The Bank of England sat at the apex of a global financial system constructed over 3 centuries of imperial expansion. British banks held assets in every country on earth. British insurance underwrote the movement of goods across every ocean. British investors owned railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, plantations in Malaya, government bonds from Tokyo to Buenos Aires. By 1914, British overseas investments stood at roughly £4 billion, almost twice the country's entire annual national income. The pound was, legally and literally, as good as gold. 300 years of accumulated financial credibility made it the most reliable instrument of value in the world. 3 years later, in the autumn of 1917, senior British officials sat in a building in New York and quietly acknowledged that the empire was functionally bankrupt. The gold was gone, the overseas investments had been liquidated, the private financial assets of British citizens had been requisitioned by their government and converted into dollars to pay for ammunition. The most powerful empire on earth had burned through 3 centuries of accumulated wealth in 36 months. And the only thing standing between Britain and a total financial collapse was the willingness of the United States to keep lending. Industrial warfare is, among other things, the most efficient mechanism ever devised for converting accumulated financial wealth into smoke. A single day of major offensive operations on the Western Front could consume more artillery shells than Britain had produced in the entire previous decade. The numbers were not just large, they were beyond any pre-war planning framework. In the first weeks of the war, the British government made a series of commitments whose financial consequences it had not fully modeled. A large ground force in France, a naval blockade of Germany, financial credits for its allies, and supply for France and Russia as well as its own forces. Each commitment was individually justifiable on military grounds. Together, they created a financial obligation growing faster than any revenue measure could keep pace with. The government issued war bonds to the British public and raised taxes, but neither was sufficient. It began to liquidate the overseas investments that represented Britain's accumulated financial power. Securities held in British private hands denominated in dollars, American railway bonds, industrial stocks, the various instruments of British investment in the United States economy were requisitioned by the Treasury. The word used was requisitioned. The practical meaning was that citizens were required to sell their assets to the government at a price the government set, in exchange for government bonds whose eventual repayment was uncertain. The transaction was dressed in the language of patriotic contribution, and many of those who participated were genuinely motivated by exactly that sentiment. But it was also, at its core, the burning of the financial furniture to keep the war burning. The critical relationship in the financial management of Britain's war effort was not with the British Treasury. It was with J.P. Morgan and Company in New York. Jack Morgan effectively became the purchasing agent for the British Empire's war effort in the United States, coordinating the procurement of food, weapons, ammunition, raw materials, and industrial equipment. He arranged credit facilities, managed the underwriting of British war loans, and persuaded American investors to lend money to a foreign government fighting a war in which the United States was officially neutral. By 1916, Britain had borrowed more from American creditors than the entire pre-war national debt of the United States. The most consequential transfer of financial power in the history of the Atlantic world had occurred, invisibly to the general public, in the account books of the Morgan Bank. The physical mechanics of the financial relationship produced some of the most dramatic logistics of the war. Britain was paying for American goods with gold, with requisitioned securities, and with credit, in roughly that order of priority. The gold component required actual physical shipment of the metal across the North Atlantic, from the Bank of England's vaults to the vaults of the United States Federal Reserve in New York. German submarines were operating throughout the North Atlantic with the explicit objective of cutting supply lines between Britain and North America. The Royal Navy provided convoy escorts, zigzagging through submarine-threatened waters on routes that changed regularly. But the gold still had to cross the ocean. The Empire's financial reserves were making a high-stakes voyage with no guaranteed outcome. The image it produces is precise. Battleships escorting cargo ships carrying literal tons of gold, the financial foundation of an empire being physically transported from one continent to another permanently, every completed crossing bringing Britain closer to the moment when there would be nothing left to send. If nobody has explained that Britain effectively went bankrupt winning the First World War, that the financial cost of victory was the end of British economic sovereignty, subscribe now. The most decisive crisis of the war was not military, but financial. Britain came closer to capitulation in a New York meeting room than on any battlefield. Stay with us. By the middle of 1916, the financial position had moved from severe to critical. The pool of requisitionable dollar securities was nearly exhausted. The gold reserve had been reduced to a level that made its continued maintenance increasingly questionable. American investors who had been buying British war bonds for 2 years were becoming cautious as the war extended, and the prospect of British default became a question responsible creditors had to consider. The Federal Reserve began issuing warnings that the accumulation of short-term British obligations was creating systemic risk in the American financial system. The meeting that crystallized the crisis took place in New York in late 1916. British officials, led by the governor of the Bank of England, reviewed the financial position honestly and without diplomatic softening. The assessment was unambiguous. Britain could not continue the war at its current rate of expenditure for more than a few more months. The requisitionable securities were gone. The gold reserves were depleted. The credit lines were at their limit. A Britain that could not pay for its armies could not maintain its armies. The empire could fight or it could pay its bills. It could not do both, and that choice did not belong to Britain. It belonged to the creditors in New York. What saved Britain was not a change in its financial position. It was a change in the political position of the United States. In April 1917, America entered the war on the Allied side. The U.S. government began making direct loans to its allies through official channels rather than private capital markets. The credit constraints that had brought Britain to the edge of collapse were lifted by the transformation of the creditor into a co-combatant. Britain could continue fighting because America had decided to underwrite the cost. Britain won the war. The cost of winning was the financial transformation of the British Empire from the world's largest creditor to its largest sovereign debtor. The overseas investments that had funded Britain's structural current account surplus were gone, liquidated to pay for ammunition. The gold that had backed the pound's convertibility was in the vaults of the Federal Reserve rather than the Bank of England. The special relationship between Britain and the United States that became the defining phrase for their bilateral connection in the following decades was built on this foundation. A debtor-creditor bond established in New York meeting rooms in 1916 and 1917. A debtor does not argue with its creditor. The Suez Crisis of 1956, when the United States used financial pressure to compel Britain to abandon a military operation it had already launched, was not an anomaly in this relationship. It was the relationship's true nature made briefly visible. The British war debt to the United States was not finally paid off until December 2006, 88 years after the armistice. 2 world wars, the end of the empire, the dismantling of the colonial system, the devaluation of the pound multiple times, the construction of the welfare state, the decline of British industrial power, the rise of American global dominance, all of this happened in the interval between the debt being incurred and the debt being settled. The century-long bill for the First World War was finally paid in the 21st century. Britain burned its furniture to keep the house warm during the war. The house survived. The furniture was gone. The generation that moved into the house after the war found it standing but stripped, colder than it had been, with the receipts from the pawned assets sitting in the accounts of creditors in New York who would require, eventually and completely, to be paid. Financial sovereignty is the only sovereignty that matters. By 1917, it no longer belonged to London. History is not over. It is underwritten.